I'm doing an 8-part series about the woman at the well, and I'm going to look at that passage verse by verse and examine it. Subscribe and join the journey. Welcome to the Chase the Sun YouTube channel, where we chase the Son of God by studying the Word of God. Today we start this study series by looking at the first 6 verses of this chapter and discuss mostly the context surrounding this Bible story. There's so many interesting things we have to cover, from the route Jesus took to Jacob's well, and so much more. Let's get right in to the Word. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. Again, this section mostly deals with context. But what context? There's a lot of details we need to look into here, and they're important to the rest of the passage. Verse 1. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. Here we have a transition from the last passage. The last passage mostly dealt with John the Baptist, of course not John the author, but John the Baptist, and his ministry declining, especially in comparison to Jesus' ministry. And in the last passage, we know that Jesus and his disciples were baptizing in the Judean countryside, not far from John the Baptist. When told this, John the Baptist responds with humility, saying that he must increase, but I must decrease. And this first verse is a perfect transition from that, as we see that Jesus' renown and the renown of his ministry is growing. He is increasing, as John foretold, to the point where now the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem and the Judean region have taken notice of what Jesus is doing. And Jesus doesn't want too much pressure to be on him at this point, because the timing of his ministry and death need to be perfect. And so what he does is he decides to leave the region and return to Galilee to avoid any conflict with these leaders at this time. Verse 2. Although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. Now John tells us something very interesting. Now, before, he's already indicated that Jesus and in his ministry baptized people. And baptism was a rededication of the people of Israel and preparing them for the coming Messiah. Now, it's noted in this verse that Jesus himself did not baptize with water. Rather, the disciples took up that task. Here we see a continuity between John's ministry, John the Baptist, and Jesus' ministry, continuing in some form in Jesus' ministry. Now, why do only the disciples practice this water baptism? Well, we know from the words of John himself that Jesus' baptism is a different baptism that is so much greater. Luke 3:16 says, John answered them all, saying, I baptize you with water, but he who is mightier than I is coming, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. So the disciples still carry out that rededication by water baptism, but Jesus is preparing to give them a greater baptism once he is glorified. Let's take a look at all 3 of the next verses and cover some context about Jesus' chosen route through Samaria. He left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given his son Joseph. Again, Jesus leaves the Judean region and departs for Galilee. Now, what's interesting is the route he took. He took a route through Samaria. Now, to give you a picture, the Judean region of Israel is in the south, and then the Galilean region is in the north. And in between, you have two regions. One is Samaria, and the other on the other side of Jordan is another region that is not Samaria, Perea, I believe. There's two options to go up to the north. Either you go through Samaria and you travel through that countryside, or you cross over Jordan and you go through the other region on the other side of Jordan. Now, because of these two possible routes, many Jews chose to go through Perea instead of going through Samaria. Why, do you ask? The Samaritans and the Jews did not get along at all, to the point where they would rather travel another route instead of go through their region. So the reason I bring this up moves into our next point that we see in this passage that is incredibly powerful. That is the fact that this route through Samaria wasn't necessary. It wasn't the only route. It wasn't the only option. But why did he do it? Well, it says he had to pass through Samaria. Why did he have to? Because this was in God's plan. This was a part of God's great plan for him to pass through Samaria, to meet the Samaritan woman, to discuss living water, and to convert an entire town. That was in God's plan. And if he had gone the other route, this wouldn't have happened. And that's why he deliberately chose to go the way of Samaria. If you don't believe me, here's another thing. The word used to say he had to pass through Samaria is used in a similar way in another verse in John. John 3:14. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. This Samaritan woman meeting is as imperative, is as important to God's plan, as necessary to God's plan as the death of Christ. Not that it is a key part in the way that it's a way of salvation, but this is a part of his plan, and it is an unchanging part of his plan. It was something he planned out, and it was an objective that he ended up achieving. And I find that amazing. Every aspect of Jesus' life and ministry is planned out by God. And John goes out of his way to highlight when God preserves that divine timing of Jesus' life. We saw it earlier when he decided to leave Judea so he wouldn't get an early arrest. And now we see it again where he chose to go through Samaria so that he might meet the Samaritan woman and tell her about his living water. Let's talk about the town mentioned in verse 5, Sychar. Honestly, very little is known about this town. Some say it is Shechem by another name. Some say it is a small town. But what we do know is it's near the well of Jacob, which, as we'll talk about in a second, does have a very definite location. Also, it is near the land that Jacob gave Joseph. And again, we will discuss that in a couple seconds. Let's take a look at verse 6. This is where we're going to really discuss some very interesting historical details. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. Around noon, which is where this time would have placed him, he decides to take a break from their journey, from their long journey. He was weary, and he stayed at the well of Jacob. He rested around there. He sat down and rested near the well. And this gives very important backdrop to the entire story here. Because Jacob's well is incredibly significant to what is discussed in this story. Like I mentioned earlier, Jacob's well is known to us today. It actually still exists today, and you can visit it today in Israel. What's interesting about Jacob's well is, unlike some other biblical landmarks, it is almost entirely undisputed. It is a very certain location, and it is something that we are well aware of where it is and where it's been placed and what it is like. So that location is sandwiched between the mountains of Gerizim and Ebal. And we'll talk about Mount Gerizim again as we get further along in this study, because that is another significant feature of this backdrop. Now, there is no direct reference to these wells in the Old Testament. What we really learn is mostly here in this passage. But there are some Old Testament verses that refer to the land that is said to be nearby, that again, Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Genesis 33:18-19 tells us that Jacob dwelled on the land that he purchased. Verse 18 and 19. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. So Jacob acquired this nearby land, and he bought it so he could live on it, even if just for a while. He ended up giving it to Joseph, one of his sons. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow. It's very likely that that verse is referring to the same plot of land referred to in the other verse. And what adds further credence to this location is the fact that Joseph was buried on that land that Jacob bought and gave to him. The site that we see as Jacob's tomb is also nearby to Jacob's well. Again, we have this huge connection to the patriarchs in this area, in this region. And again, we will discuss that in just a second. Now the question arises, why did Jacob dig a well? What was the purpose of that? Why would he dig a well? Well, no pun intended, there are a couple different reasons why he would do that. Again, the biblical account is limited to today's passage, or the passage we are going to study throughout this series. Let's take a look at verse 12. Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. The one with the well indicates that Jacob built this well for very practical reasons, to quench his thirst and the thirst of his livestock and his family, to make sure that they all had water. During these times, water was incredibly valuable. So as a result, when you bought a piece of land, water wasn't always in the deal. You wouldn't get access to all the neighboring streams by default. And while there were many streams in the area of Jacob's well, either he didn't have access to those streams, or at least he didn't attempt to negotiate access to those streams. On top of that, it may have just been more self-sustaining to dig his own well instead. And it was the right decision, because that well remains even to today, and it still produces clean and flavorful, yet not too heavy, water. And that water, again, is still drinkable today. Now, I've been alluding to it for a while now, but let's quickly discuss what was the current understandings and perceptions of Jacob's well, especially by the Samaritans. The Samaritans only used the Pentateuch as their main scriptures. And as a result, the figures in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, for those who do not know, including the patriarchs, are very highly elevated. So Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, all those first forefathers of the Israelite people are seen in very high regard, almost venerated among the Samaritans. And as a result, Jacob's well wasn't simply a source of good water, it was almost a site or a relic passed down to them by their great forefather. Jacob's well is a very important backdrop to Jesus' discussion, because ultimately his goal, especially in the first section of this conversation with the woman, he is showing that he is greater than Jacob. Jacob, who was able to create this long-lasting, quality well, ultimately Jesus is still greater. He is able to create infinite and even better living water than what we see in the well of Jacob. And that's why it's important to see how amazing Jacob's well truly is, to understand how much greater Jesus' living water is. And we'll discuss that more next time. We talk about that living water that Jesus offers the woman at the well. Thank you so much for watching. Today we learned some important points of context about Jacob's well, the route through Samaria, and be sure to subscribe and watch out for more videos in this Bible study series. Be sure to turn on notification bells as well so you can be the first to watch these new Bible examined, verse by verse Bible study videos. God bless, and remember to chase the eternal Son of God with me.